In July of 1863, as Union forces advanced through Mississippi during the Vicksburg Campaign, Captain William Harrison of the 12th Iowa Infantry received reports of unusual activity at a plantation near the Big Black River. Local freedmen, recently liberated by the Union advance, told stories about Riverside Plantation that made even hardened soldiers uncomfortable. They spoke of white children being kept as slaves. They described a breeding operation unlike anything the soldiers had encountered before. When Harrison and his men finally entered Riverside Plantation on July 18, 1863, they discovered a horror that would be deliberately omitted from official records for over 80 years. In the slave quarters, they found 16 children ranging in age from 6 months to 9 years old. All of them were light-skinned, with features that clearly marked them as mixed race. And when the investigation revealed who their mothers were, even Union officers who had witnessed the worst atrocities of war were left speechless. The children had been born to the plantation owner's 3 daughters, forced by their own father into a systematic breeding program designed to save his failing estate. Tonight, we reveal the complete story of Marcus Thornton and the monstrous plan he implemented to avoid bankruptcy, a plan that destroyed his family and exposed one of the darkest aspects of American slavery. Before we continue, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell right now, because stories like this, stories that were deliberately buried in sealed military archives and family records, need to be told. These are the nightmares that textbooks skip over. The crimes so disturbing that even historians hesitate to discuss them fully. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Have you heard stories like this from your own region's history? Let's connect and share these hidden truths that shaped America. Warren County, Mississippi in 1858 was cotton country, part of the fertile Mississippi Delta, where vast plantations stretched for thousands of acres, and where human beings were bought and sold like livestock. The county sat along the Mississippi River, with the town of Vicksburg serving as a major trading hub for cotton, slaves, and all the commerce that sustained the plantation economy. This was the heart of the Deep South, where slavery was not just an institution but the foundation of everything: the economy, the social structure, the entire way of life. Riverside Plantation had been in the Thornton family since 1820. Marcus Thornton's father had established it with money inherited from a shipping business in Charleston. At its peak in the 1840s, Riverside comprised 2,800 acres of prime cotton land and employed 87 enslaved people. It was a successful operation that provided the Thornton family with wealth, status, and all the privileges that came with being part of the planter aristocracy. But by 1858, when our story begins, Riverside was in serious trouble. Marcus Thornton was 52 years old in 1858, a man who had inherited wealth and position but lacked the business sense to maintain either. He was known in Vicksburg society as someone who gambled heavily, made poor investment decisions, and lived well beyond his means, even by the standards of wealthy planters. His wife Eleanor had died in 1854, giving birth to their 4th child, a son who also did not survive. Her death had sent Marcus into a spiral of gambling and drinking that accelerated Riverside's decline. The plantation was deeply in debt by 1858. Marcus owed money to banks in Natchez and New Orleans. He had borrowed from other planters. He had taken loans from cotton factors and merchants. The total debt was somewhere around $35,000, an enormous sum at the time. His creditors were beginning to demand payment, and Marcus was running out of options. He had already sold 23 of his enslaved workers to cover immediate debts, but this only provided temporary relief while permanently reducing his labor force, and therefore his ability to produce cotton profitably. Marcus had 3 daughters from his marriage to Eleanor. Catherine was 19 years old in 1858, a beautiful young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She had been educated by private tutors and could speak French, play piano, and manage household accounts. She was everything a planter daughter should be: graceful, accomplished and raised to marry well and maintain her family status. Margaret was 17, more shy than her older sister but equally well educated and refined. She loved reading and spent hours in the Plantation library. And Rebecca, the youngest at 15, was still very much a girl, full of energy and curiosity about the world beyond Riverside. The three daughters had no sons to inherit the plantation or protect their futures. Their one brother had died with their mother. This meant that Riverside's fate and their own fates depended entirely on their father making good decisions. Unfortunately, Marcus Thornton was about to make the worst decision imaginable. The idea came to Marcus during one of his trips to Natchez in the spring of 1858. He was there ostensibly to negotiate an extension on one of his loans, but in reality, he spent most of his time gambling in establishments along the riverfront. It was in one of these gambling houses that he overheard a conversation between slave traders discussing the economics of their business. They were talking about breeding operations, plantations that specialized in producing enslaved children who could be sold at high prices to cotton planters in the newly opened territories of Arkansas and Texas. The economics were brutally simple. A healthy enslaved child could be sold for $400 to $600 by age 10. An enslaved woman of childbearing age could produce a child every 15 to 18 months under the right conditions. With careful management and multiple women, a breeding operation could generate substantial steady income. The traders discussed all of this with the same tone they might use to discuss livestock breeding, which is exactly how they viewed it. Marcus listened to this conversation with growing interest. He began calculating in his head. He had 12 enslaved women of childbearing age remaining on Riverside. If each produced a child every 18 months, that would be 8 children per year. At $500 each, that was $4,000. Yours, $20,000. It would not clear all his debts immediately, but it would stabilize his finances and buy him time. But there was a problem with this calculation. Enslaved women did not reliably produce children on schedule. Pregnancy was unpredictable. Children often died in infancy. And most importantly, Marcus did not have 5 years. His creditors were pressing him now. He needed a solution that would work faster and more reliably. It was then, sitting in that gambling house in Natchez with whiskey in his glass and desperation in his heart, that Marcus Thornton had the thought that would damn him. His daughters were white women of childbearing age. Under the law, the children of enslaved women were automatically enslaved regardless of paternity. But what if the situation could be reversed? What if he could somehow arrange for his daughters to bear children who could be legally classified as slaves? The idea was monstrous, but Marcus' mind, warped by years of treating human beings as property and seeing everything through the lens of profit and loss, began working through the logistics. If his daughters bore children by enslaved men, the children would be of mixed race. With carefully forged documents, such children could potentially be registered as the offspring of enslaved women, making them legal property that could be sold. It would require deception and careful management, but it was theoretically possible. Over the following weeks, Marcus refined his plan with the cold calculation of a businessman evaluating an investment opportunity. He would need to keep the pregnancies and births secret from Vicksburg society. He would need to forge birth certificates and registry documents. He would need to break his daughters psychologically so they would not resist or reveal what was happening. And he would need to select enslaved men carefully based on physical appearance to ensure the children would be marketable. The plan was evil in its conception, but Marcus convinced himself it was necessary. He told himself he was saving Riverside, preserving his daughter's inheritance, doing what had to be done in desperate times. He never seemed to consider that he was planning to sexually traffic his own children, to enslave his own grandchildren, to destroy everything that should have been sacred about family. The fact that he could contemplate such actions reveals how completely the system of slavery had corrupted his moral sense. Marcus began implementing his plan in the summer of 1858. His first step was to psychologically prepare his daughters for what he intended to do to them. He started holding family meetings where he discussed the plantation's financial situation in increasingly dire terms. He told his daughters they faced losing everything, that they would be cast out into the world with nothing, that their only hope was to make sacrifices for the family. Catherine, the eldest, understood immediately that something was wrong with her father's behavior. He had become secretive, spending long hours alone in his study, emerging with strange questions about the family's enslaved workers and their physical characteristics. When she tried to discuss these concerns with her sisters, Marcus overheard and became enraged. He locked Catherine in her room for 3 days with minimal food, telling her this was a small taste of what poverty would mean for them. In September 1858, Marcus revealed his plan to his daughters. He called them to his study and explained with the cold logic of a business proposal that they would each need to bear children who would be sold as slaves to save the plantation. When the girls reacted with horror and refusal, Marcus revealed the extent of his preparation. He had already forged documents. He had already selected the enslaved men who would father these children. He had already calculated how much money this would generate and how it would save them from destitution. Catherine, Margaret, and Rebecca were trapped. They had no money of their own, no legal rights that would allow them to resist their father, no place to go if they ran away. Unmarried women in 1858 Mississippi had few options and even fewer protections. Their father held absolute authority over them legally and practically. When they continued to refuse, Marcus demonstrated he was willing to use force. He had Catherine dragged to one of the slave cabins and locked inside with an enslaved man named Joshua. What happened in that cabin would destroy Catherine psychologically and mark the beginning of Marcus' systematic abuse of his own daughters. The first pregnancy occurred in October 1858. Catherine, traumatized and broken by what had been done to her, barely spoke for weeks. She existed in a state of shock, unable to process what was happening. Marcus, showing no concern for her emotional state, simply noted the pregnancy in his records and began planning for the next phase. Margaret was forced into the same situation in November. She tried to resist more actively than Catherine had, even attempting to injure herself to avoid pregnancy. But Marcus, anticipating resistance, had her restrained and ensured his plan proceeded. Rebecca, witnessing what was happening to her older sisters, tried to run away in December. She made it almost 20 miles before being caught and returned to Riverside. Marcus' response to Rebecca's escape attempt was to have all 3 daughters move to a section of the plantation house that he could lock from the outside. They were prisoners in their own home, guarded to ensure they could not escape or seek help. The enslaved people on the plantation witnessed what was happening, but were powerless to intervene. Several tried to help the girls, and Marcus responded by selling them immediately to the most brutal plantations he could find, making clear what would happen to anyone who interfered. Catherine's first child was born in June 1859. The birth was difficult, and Marcus allowed no doctor to attend, fearing outside witnesses. An enslaved midwife named Hannah was forced to assist, threatened with being sold away from her own children if she spoke of what she saw. The baby was a boy, light-skinned, but not so light that he could pass as white. Marcus immediately took the child from Catherine and brought him to the slave quarters, where he was given to an enslaved woman whose own child had recently died. The forged birth certificate listed this woman as the mother, making the child legally enslaved and Marcus' property to sell. Marcus sold the baby 3 weeks later to a slave trader passing through Vicksburg. The trader asked no questions about a mixed-race infant, assuming it was the result of the common practice of masters abusing enslaved women. He paid $350, less than Marcus had hoped but still substantial. Marcus recorded the sale in his ledgers under expenses for new agricultural equipment, disguising the source of the income. Margaret gave birth in July 1859, Rebecca in August. Both children were immediately separated from their mothers and registered as enslaved. Both were sold within weeks. Marcus had generated over $1,000 in just 3 months, proving the profitability of his monstrous scheme. But the physical and emotional toll on his daughters was catastrophic. Catherine developed severe postpartum depression and spent weeks barely eating or speaking. Margaret had complications from her delivery that left her in constant pain. Rebecca, the youngest, suffered a psychological break and began having episodes where she could not recognize where she was or who she was. Marcus showed no concern for any of this, focusing only on the success of his breeding program and planning the next pregnancies. Between 1859 and 1862, the 3 Thornton daughters gave birth to a total of 14 children. Catherine had 5 pregnancies, Margaret had 5, and Rebecca had 4. The pregnancies came with brutal regularity, each daughter being forced to conceive again within months of giving birth. The physical damage was severe. Catherine developed infections that modern medicine would have treated easily, but that in 1859 Mississippi nearly killed her. Margaret suffered permanent damage during a particularly difficult labor. Rebecca, who had been only 15 when this nightmare began, showed signs of physical trauma that suggested she might never fully recover. The children were all immediately separated from their mothers and sold. Marcus became practiced at forging documents and established relationships with slave traders who asked no questions as long as they were paid. The income from these sales allowed Marcus to pay down his debts gradually and keep Riverside operational. To the outside world, it appeared he had somehow stabilized his finances. No one questioned the source of his new income. The enslaved people at Riverside knew what was happening, but they were powerless to stop it or report it. The legal system offered them no recourse. Speaking out would only result in being sold or killed. Several did try to help the daughters in small ways, smuggling extra food or offering comfort, but these acts of kindness were done at great personal risk. The daughters themselves existed in a state of constant trauma. They were prisoners, subjected to repeated sexual assault and forced pregnancy, having their children stolen and sold. They developed various psychological coping mechanisms. Catherine retreated into silence, barely speaking even to her sisters. Margaret became numb, going through the motions of existence without seeming to be present. Rebecca alternated between rage and complete withdrawal. Marcus convinced himself that he was doing what was necessary to preserve the family legacy, that his daughters would eventually understand and forgive him once Riverside was saved. He showed no recognition of the profound evil of his actions or the permanent damage he was inflicting on his own children. The system of slavery had so completely warped his moral sense that he could not see his daughters as human beings deserving of protection and love, only as resources to be exploited for economic survival. By early 1863, Marcus had generated approximately $6,000 from selling his daughter's children, a significant sum that had allowed him to pay off several debts and stabilize Riverside's finances. He had plans to continue the program indefinitely, perhaps even expanding it by forcing his daughters to bear more children at shorter intervals. He believed he had created a sustainable solution to his financial problems, but the Civil War was changing everything. Union forces were advancing through Mississippi, and the plantation economy that had sustained men like Marcus was collapsing. In May 1863, Union General Ulysses Grant began the Vicksburg Campaign, a military operation designed to take control of the Mississippi River by capturing the key fortress city of Vicksburg. Riverside Plantation sat directly in the path of the Union advance. As federal troops moved through the area in July 1863, enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines, seeking freedom and safety. They brought with them stories of what was happening on various plantations, information that Union commanders used to understand the region, and identify potential threats. It was several freedmen from Riverside who told Union soldiers about the white women being held prisoner and the light-skinned children being kept in the slave quarters. Captain William Harrison was initially skeptical of these reports. They seemed too extreme, too much like propaganda designed to paint all slaveholders as monsters. But the freedmen were insistent and specific in their details. They described the layout of Riverside, the location of the locked rooms where the daughters were kept, the number and ages of children in the quarters. Their testimony was too detailed and consistent to dismiss. Harrison led a squad of 20 soldiers to Riverside Plantation on July 18, 1863. They arrived in the early morning, moving quickly to prevent any resistance or destruction of evidence. Marcus Thornton met them on the porch with a rifle, demanding they leave his property. Harrison, showing his authorization from General Grant to inspect plantations and liberate enslaved people, informed Marcus he had no choice but to allow entry. What the Union soldiers found exceeded even the disturbing reports they had received. The 3 Thornton daughters were found in locked rooms, malnourished and showing signs of physical abuse and psychological trauma. Catherine was barely responsive, sitting and staring at nothing. Margaret had visible scars from difficult deliveries. Rebecca appeared to be in the middle of another pregnancy. In the slave quarters, soldiers found 16 light-skinned children ranging from 6 months to 9 years old. Their features made it clear they were of mixed heritage, and their similarity to each other suggested they shared parentage. When soldiers asked the enslaved women caring for these children who their mothers were, the truth began to emerge. These children had been born to the Thornton daughters but registered as enslaved. Several of the older children, when questioned gently, could remember their actual mothers, the white women in the house. The physical evidence was extensive. Harrison and his men found Marcus ledgers documenting the sales of children, though he had disguised these transactions in the account books. They found forged birth certificates. They found letters from slave traders confirming purchases of mixed-race infants and young children. And most damningly, they found Marcus' journal, where he had documented his breeding program in detail, treating it as an agricultural experiment worthy of careful notation. Marcus was arrested immediately. Harrison sent urgent dispatches to his commanding officers describing what had been discovered. The case was unusual and legally complex. Marcus had committed crimes that had no clear precedent. He essentially enslaved his own grandchildren, but under the laws of Mississippi in 1863, children of enslaved fathers were legally enslaved regardless of their mother's status. Marcus had exploited this legal ambiguity in the most horrific way imaginable. The daughters were taken into protective custody and eventually moved to a Union hospital in Memphis. Their physical recovery was slow, and their psychological recovery would take far longer if it ever came at all. Catherine never fully regained the ability to function independently. Margaret developed severe anxiety that made it difficult for her to be around men. Rebecca, who was pregnant at the time of the rescue, gave birth to a daughter in September 1863, but was unable to care for the child emotionally. The 16 children found at Riverside were legally freed by the Union occupation and the eventual passage of the 13th Amendment. But their futures were uncertain. Most were too young to remember much about their origins. Several were adopted by freedmen families. Others ended up in orphanages. A few of the older children eventually learned the truth about their parentage, that they were the products of forced incest and had been enslaved by their own grandfather. This knowledge was itself a form of trauma. Marcus Thornton was tried by a Union military tribunal in September 1863. The charges were complex, involving violations of numerous federal and moral laws. The tribunal heard testimony from the daughters, though their testimony was limited because of their traumatized state. They heard from enslaved people who had witnessed what happened. They examined the documentary evidence found at Riverside. The verdict was unanimous. Marcus Thornton was found guilty of multiple crimes, including incest, rape, human trafficking, and fraud. The sentence was death by firing squad. In his sentencing statement, the presiding colonel said that Marcus had committed acts so depraved that they defied decent description, that he had betrayed every duty a father owed to his children, and that he had proven himself to be a monster, wearing human form. Marcus showed little emotion during the trial or sentencing. He maintained that he had done what was necessary to save his plantation, that his daughters would have understood if given time, and that he was being persecuted by Yankees who did not understand Southern ways. His complete lack of remorse or recognition of wrongdoing was perhaps more disturbing than his crimes themselves. The execution was carried out on October 12, 1863, at a Union military camp outside Vicksburg. According to records, Marcus' final words were not an apology or expression of remorse, but a complaint that the government had no right to interfere in family matters. He died believing he had been wronged rather than recognizing the evil he had committed. Riverside Plantation was confiscated by Union forces and eventually sold at auction after the war. The money from the sale was supposed to be used to provide for the Thornton daughters and their children, but in the chaos of Reconstruction, much of it was lost to corruption and mismanagement. The plantation house stood empty for years before being demolished in 1879. Today, the land is part of a larger farm operation, and there is no marker indicating what happened there. The Thornton daughters lived the rest of their lives dealing with the trauma Marcus had inflicted. Catherine spent most of her remaining years in institutions, never fully recovering her mental stability. She died in 1881 at age 42. Margaret was able to live independently, but never married or had relationships with men. She worked as a seamstress and lived quietly in a boarding house in Memphis until her death in 1903. Rebecca eventually married a Union veteran who treated her with kindness and patience. She had 2 more children in this marriage, pregnancies that were chosen rather than forced. She lived until 1912, dying at age 69. The case was documented in Union military records but was not widely publicized. The details were considered too disturbing and too politically complicated. Southern sympathizers might use the case as propaganda, claiming the Union was making up atrocities. Northern audiences might find the truth too horrifying to believe. So the records were filed away, classified, and largely forgotten. It was not until 1947 that a historian researching Civil War documents discovered the Thornton case in the National Archives. Even then, the historian hesitated to publish the details, questioning whether such horror had actually occurred or if the records were somehow fabricated. It was not until DNA testing became available in the 1990s that researchers were able to confirm through descendants that the case was real, that Marcus Thornton had indeed done what the records describe. The Thornton case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American slavery and patriarchal authority. It shows how the dehumanization at the heart of slavery could extend even to one's own family when economic desperation combined with absolute power. It reveals how legal structures that treated humans as property created possibilities for abuse that went beyond what we typically imagine when we think about historical slavery. Perhaps most disturbing is that the Thornton case, while extreme, was not entirely unique. Research has uncovered other instances where planters forced their female relatives into bearing children who were then enslaved and sold. These cases were rare, but not unheard of, suggesting that the Thornton case represented not an isolated aberration, but an extreme point on a spectrum of abuse that slavery made possible. The case also raises questions about silence and complicity. The enslaved people at Riverside knew what was happening, but had no power to stop it. Neighbors may have suspected something, but chose not to investigate. The slave traders who bought mixed-race infants from Marcus asked no questions because such children were common products of masters abusing enslaved women. The entire system was structured to enable abuse and punish those who tried to expose or resist it. What do you think about this case? How could such horror have been prevented? What does it tell us about the nature of slavery and unchecked patriarchal authority? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If this story disturbed you, share it with someone who needs to understand that history is often darker and more complex than we want to believe. Subscribe for more stories that reveal the hidden horrors of America's past. See you in the next video.